Hey there. Tonight, we begin with a piece of clay no larger than a hand, sleeping in a cool museum drawer in London. And pressed into that dark little circle is a question so strange, it almost feels impolite to ask. Why did ancient scribes record the moon and the stars with a kind of confidence that seems far older than their age? And why did they keep saying, so calmly, that the knowledge was not theirs to begin with? A small map of the night sky, a moon treated like a station rather than a stone, and a civilization that appeared with writing, numbers, temples, an organized memory, almost as if someone had leaned close and whispered the instructions first. If that kind of mystery is your sort of evening, take a moment to like the video and subscribe as well, because it helps these long, quiet journeys keep finding their way through the dark. Now settle in a little, let the room soften around you, and let us walk back to the beginning, where the oldest written voices on earth looked up at the moon and did not see emptiness. It is easy, from the safe brightness of the modern world, to think of the moon as settled. We have photographs of it, measurements of it, diagrams, landers, dust samples, careful explanations, all the neat furniture of certainty. But the ancient Sumerians did not leave behind the feeling of certainty. They left behind something much stranger. They left behind the feeling that the moon was near in more ways than distance, that it stood at the edge of human sight like a gate marker, the first station, the first sign that the heavens were not just there, but arranged. The story often begins, in modern retellings, with a tablet in the British Museum, a small clay fragment catalogued as K8538. Even saying the number softly has a curious effect, like reading a room label before entering somewhere colder than expected. The fragment is worn, broken at the edges, darkened by age, and yet still precise in the old, stubborn way that fired clay can be. Wedge marks cover its surface in radiating sections. Scholars call it a planisphere, a flattened map of the celestial sphere. That sounds respectable and tidy. It also sounds smaller than it feels. Because when you sit with the object in your mind, really sit with it, the troubling part is not that ancient scribes drew stars. Human beings have always looked up. We have always traced patterns in darkness. The troubling part is that the fragment seems to preserve more than admiration. It preserves direction, calculation, motion, not just where certain stars could be seen, but how paths were understood, how something moved, how a route through the sky might be plotted as if the heavens were legible to minds already trained in a hidden grammar. I have always found that strange, perhaps stranger than any simple tale of gods coming down in a blaze of fire. A miracle can be dismissed by calling it poetry. A precise table of motion is harder to brush aside. It sits there with all the quiet patience of arithmetic. It does not demand belief. It only asks how the numbers got there. If you were standing in one of those museum vaults with me, you would not hear thunder or ritual chanting. You would hear air conditioning, perhaps the soft slide of a drawer, the hush that old collections seem to keep even when no one is speaking. Then the fragment would appear under controlled light, resting in its compartment like a dark moon of its own. No glowing aura, no golden pedestal, just clay, dust, pressure marks made by a hand long gone. And still, somehow, the thing would feel alive with implication. The source we are following begins there for a reason. It wants the mystery to arrive not as fantasy, but as an object, a thing, a record small enough to hold, old enough to humble us, and stubborn enough to survive every empire that tried to outlive mud and fire. That is how deep history often speaks, not through spectacle, but through survival. The Mesopotamian world, especially the Sumerian world that stands behind later Babylonian and Assyrian tradition, did not treat the moon as a dead ornament hung above the earth. It treated the moon as a governing presence in time, ritual, and celestial order. In the older Sumerian language, the moon god was Nana. In Akkadian, he becomes Sen. The names shift as languages and powers shift. The importance does not. The moon rules months, festivals, measurements, timing, repetition, return. But beneath all that, the texts carry another mood, one that is harder to settle. The moon is not only useful, it is prior. It is near. It is first. First station. That phrase matters. It is one of those phrases that can sound harmless until you let it sit in silence for a while. A station implique placement. Assignment. Function. A marker along a route. Not merely a body observed, but a point in a system. The old texts repeatedly frame the heavens as ordered territory, not empty distance. Divine powers are assigned. Paths are fixed. Movements are governed. The moon, nearest to the earth and most visibly regular, becomes the threshold object, the first lesson in celestial order. That regularity itself must have felt uncanny to ancient observers. Night after night the moon changes, but not randomly. It grows, it rounds, it thins, it vanishes, it returns. It slips through the constellations with a patience almost mechanical. Even now, when we can explain the mechanics, there is something emotionally unnerving about it. You know that feeling when something repeats so perfectly that it stops feeling natural and starts feeling arranged? The moon has that effect on people. The priests of Mesopotamia tracked it with an intensity that still surprises scholars who study the tablets in detail. They were not merely glancing upward to see whether the month had begun. They were measuring phases, recording eclipse timings, comparing cycles, calculating the length of the lunar month to astonishing accuracy. This is where the soft religious language of hymns begins to brush against the harder edges of mathematics. And that is where the modern mind becomes uncomfortable. It can tolerate a moon god. It can tolerate ancient devotion. What it does not quite know what to do with is devotion that keeps producing correct numbers. The old texts say the knowledge was taught. That point returns again and again, almost to the point of annoyance, as if the scribes themselves anticipated that later people would try to explain everything away as patient trial and error. They say the great beings, the Anunnaki, came from the heavens, established order on earth, distributed the me, and handed down the principles by which civilization would function. Among those principles was knowledge of the sky. The me deserve a slow moment here, because they are often reduced to vague divine powers when in fact they feel much more practical, almost unnervingly practical. In the texts, they are not airy ideas drifting around a temple song. They are treated like discrete, transferable authorities and capabilities. Kingship, priesthood, writing, judgment, music, craft, truth, warfare, sexual order, the destruction of cities, administration, social roles, techniques, functions, patterns by which a civilization knows how to behave. The me feel less like abstract virtues and more like encoded protocols. The world works because certain knowledge packages have been distributed into it. That is a very cold way to put it, I know, but honestly it is also a very Mesopotamian feeling way to put it. Their cities were not dream palaces. They were administrative marvels built out of mud, raid, sweat, and astonishing discipline. Irrigation had to be maintained. Grain had to be counted. Labor had to be organized. Writing had to do real work. A culture like that does not preserve the idea of received knowledge carelessly. If it keeps insisting that it was taught, the claim itself becomes part of the evidence. And so the moon enters not just as an object in the sky, but as part of a transmitted system. If the heavens are ordered, if stations are assigned, if celestial paths carry meaning, then the moon becomes the nearest readable sign of a structure larger than the human world. That is why the old priests tracked it so obsessively, not simply because it made a convenient calendar, though, of course, it did. They tracked it because it mattered in a deeper way, because they believed it had been appointed. Picture a priest standing on the upper terrace of a temple at Ur. The night air is cooler now, touched by river damp and the faint smell of clay cooling after a hot day. Below him, the city is dim, oil lamps trembling in courtyards, dogs turning once before sleep, someone murmuring in a room beyond a wall. Above him, the moon lifts itself over the dark line of the world. He has a stylus. He has a clay surface prepared. He has numbers already memorized, procedures already inherited, expectations already set by teachers before him. He is not inventing the sky. He is reading it. That distinction between inventing and reading may be the quiet heart of the whole story. The standard modern explanation is not absurd. It says that over long centuries, careful observers refined their records, corrected their errors, and slowly developed the methods needed to calculate the moon with increasing precision. There is truth in that. Human beings are clever, and patience can achieve a great deal. But the source script presses against that comfort by pointing out how early the sophistication appears, how complete some of the mathematical foundations already seem, and how consistently the ancient texts themselves deny the flattering idea of self-invention. Sumer does not speak like a civilization congratulating itself on discovery. It speaks like a civilization remembering instruction. That is why this investigation cannot begin with the moon alone. It has to begin with Sumer itself, with marshland and mud brick, with the first cities and the first writing, with the old unsettling fact that civilization in southern Mesopotamia seems to rise not lazily and gradually, but with a startling completeness, as if several doors had already been unlocked by the time the written record begins. Writing appears ready to handle complexity. Mathematics appears fit for administration. Temples appear as if built within an established sacred logic. Kingship is said to descend from heaven, not emerge from tribal ambition. It is all a little too composed. Not impossible, just composed. That is a different sort of unease. Not the unease of monsters, but of structure. The kind you feel when you enter a very old building and realize the proportions are too confident for a first attempt. Someone knew what they were doing before the surviving wall was built. Someone had already learned the lesson before this copy was made. The moon, in the story we are entering, is like that surviving wall. It is the nearest copy of a larger order. The first visible sign, the first station, the first lesson. And perhaps that is why the old tablets keep returning to it with such strange tenderness and rigor. The moon is gentle to look at, even when it is sharp and cold. It moves without haste. It calms animals. It quiets ruined places. It lies over temple stairs and river water and broken city walls with the same pale patience. Yet in Mesopotamian thought, it is also a governor of time, a measurable authority, a threshold body connecting the visible world to a higher arrangement, a soothing face with a hard mathematics behind it. Before we can ask what the moon meant to the Sumerians, we have to walk down into the world that first gave their claims a home. Not the world of later museum labels and confident documentaries, but the older one. The one built in damp river country where the land was half gift and half problem. Southern Mesopotamia was never a gentle place in the ordinary sense. It had mud, abundance, mosquitoes, heat, salt, flood risk, reed marshes, shifting channels, and the constant need to turn water into order before water turned order back into mud again. And yet this was where some of the first cities rose. If you imagine the region in the deep past, the picture comes slowly into focus. Low horizons, wet ground giving underfoot. The smell of river, silt, and cut reed. Small settlements at first. Huts clustered near reliable water. People moving carefully between marsh and cultivated edge. Then, over centuries, something changes. The huts thicken into neighborhoods. Storage becomes more deliberate. Temples rise. Walls appear. Labor organizes. Fields extend. Boat traffic thickens. A place begins to remember itself from season to season. Then it remembers itself long enough to become a city. Eridu, Uruk, Ur, Nippur. These names still carry a strange weight, even when spoken in a modern room half a world away. They sound both intimate and impossibly old, like words that had already worn smooth before later empires learned how to boast. The source script leans on that feeling because it matters. These cities were not primitive in any childish sense. By the time writing emerges clearly in the record, the society using it is already administratively alive. That is the first anomaly. Sumer does not appear in the surviving evidence like a toddler learning balance. It appears like a mind already standing. Writing is part of why this feels so startling. Around the late 4th millennium before Christ, cuneiform appears in recognizable form. That sentence gets repeated so often in textbooks that it can sound almost dull. It should not. Because what appears is not a few hesitant scratches only barely able to count sheep. What appears is a system quickly capable of receipts, lists, inventories, notational complexity, grammar, signs with layered values, the management of abstract categories, and eventually literature, law, hymns, astronomy, medicina, correspondence, and epic reflection. The leap from no writing to useful writing seems unnervingly compressed. Some scholars will rightly remind us that development must have preceded surviving examples, that perishable materials may be lost, that early experimentation does not always survive. All true. Yet even after granting all of that, one still feels a certain pressure in the evidence. The system looks ready unusually fast. You know that feeling when you find an old notebook and realize the first surviving page is already mid-argument, as though the beginning has been torn away. Sumer feels like that. The surviving first page is not simple enough to be the true beginning. The same sensation appears in urban organization. By the Uruk period, we are not dealing with tiny improvisations. We are dealing with monumental temple platforms, managed labor, stored grain, long-distance exchange, symbolic authority, and an emerging social machinery that already understands scale. The White Temple at Uruk did not rise from the earth because a few villagers had a nice week. It required design, planning, hierarchy, supply, and a vision of sacred centrality already stronger than household life. City-making had become a discipline. That is why the Sumerian claim of received civilization matters so much. It is not an ornamental myth pasted onto a weak society trying to flatter itself. It is a self-explanation embedded in one of the earliest and most structurally impressive urban cultures on Earth. When such a culture says kingship was lowered from heaven, the sentence may still be mythic. Yes, but it is not intellectually careless. It is framing reality the way the civilization genuinely understood it. The Sumerian king list is perhaps the clearest place where that worldview speaks with blunt calm. On the Weld Blundell Prism, now in Oxford, the old phrase appears with all the authority of a line, copied because it mattered. When kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Not invented in Eridu, not fought over there until one ambitious man won. Lowered from heaven, established, situated, given. It is one of the most quietly radical claims in all of ancient literature. Political order itself is not a human improvisation. It is a transmission. And then come the antediluvian kings, with their immense, impossible reign lengths. 28,800 years. 36,000 years. Numbers large enough to invite laughter from anyone determined to stay modern and comfortable. Yet even here, the list is less random than it first appears. The numbers have structure. They are tied to the sexagesimal system, to multiples of 3,600. To a mathematical culture already thinking in patterns, we still live inside every time we divide a circle or glance at a clock. Even the exaggeration, if exaggeration is what it is disciplined, that is another reason the story lingers. The old texts are never merely wild. They are ordered in their wildness. The Sumerians keep insisting that the foundations of civilization, kingship, law, writing, ritual, skilled labor, and even complex cultural capacities, were not discovered from nothing. They were distributed through the me. The me move through the literature like sealed powers and procedures, at once divine and practical. When Inanna receives them from Enki in the old story, she is not merely collecting symbols. She is carrying away the capacities by which city life becomes possible. It is almost funny in a dry way. One could call it theology, and one would be right. One could also call it the transfer of civilizational software. And the old text would not protest nearly as much as a modern person might. That is why Eridu matters so deeply in these traditions. It was remembered as the first city, the first place where kingship descended, the cult center of Enki, the god of wisdom, craft, and the freshwater deep called the Abzu. Excavation there revealed temple after temple built atop the same sacred spot, one layer over another. Continuity pressed into architecture for centuries. A people kept returning to that same location, as if the place itself held memory more securely than speech. If you were standing there in the ancient period, before the ruins, before the scholarly diagrams, before the world forgot how to pronounce half the names correctly, you would smell damp clay and water. You would hear workers, birds, distant animals, the soft slap of movement near the reed line. The temple itself would rise not like a mystery movie prop, but like a center of gravity. Scribes trained there. Administrators worked there. Offerings were handled there. Knowledge was copied there. Sacred and practical life were fused so tightly that separating temple from archive would have felt artificial. Honestly, that may be one of the hardest things for modern readers to recover. We are trained to imagine religion in one drawer, science in another, administration in another, myth in another. The Sumerian world did not feel obliged to keep its drawers so tidy. The temple was a religious house. Yes. It was also a school, a repository, a court, an economic center, a training ground in writing and number, and a place where the structure of reality was continually rehearsed. Knowledge was sacred because it made civilization possible. Sacredness was practical because it organized the world. Once you understand that, the old claims about divine teaching stop sounding decorative. They become embedded in the logic of everyday life. The source script makes this point by circling repeatedly around the idea that Sumerians did not think of themselves as pioneers in the modern heroic sense. They thought of themselves as recipients, students, not inventors. That is a humbling self-portrait for the first literate urban civilization we know this well. Most cultures like to flatter themselves. Sumer does something stranger. It roots its greatness in prior instruction. Even the flood traditions fit that pattern. In the Eridu Genesis, in Atrahasis, in later related versions, catastrophe nearly sweeps away humanity, and yet Enki intervenes to preserve not just breathing bodies, but seed, shil, continuity, and the possibility of rebuilding. Knowledge is treated like something too valuable to let drown. It survives because a preserving intelligence ensures it survives. Civilizational memory is carried through disaster. That matters for the moon story because it means the Sumerian world already contains a powerful model of transmitted and preserved order. Knowledge comes from above or beyond. Knowledge is stored, distributed, guarded, nearly lost, and then saved. The moon later enters that framework as the first celestial marker in a system already defined by reception and preservation. Nothing about it is accidental. I have always found the emotional atmosphere of Sumer difficult to describe without sounding a little bewitched by it. It is at once earthy and formal. Reed baskets and cosmic order. Kiln smoke and divine decrees. Accountancy and hymns. Mud under the nails of workers and calculations precise enough to challenge later assumptions about how knowledge is supposed to grow. It feels like a civilization with both feet in the mud and both eyes somewhere beyond the horizon. If you were walking through Uruk at sunrise, perhaps the streets still cool before the full assault of heat, you might see laborers carrying baskets, a temple wall catching the first gold light, a scribe already seated with damp clay and a stylus. Nearby, a priest or administrator passes with the kind of practiced calm that comes from living inside procedures older than his own memory. Somewhere there is grain to count, some boundary to record, some omen to compare with precedent, some lunar phase to place properly within the month. The whole city lives inside a rhythm of received forms. It knows what to do because the world has been organized for it already. And this is where the modern explanation begins to feel thinner than it first seems. It says, reasonably enough, that ancient people mythologized their own development because they did not understand long social processes from inside. They projected divine founders onto historical change. They made the gods authors of what human communities slowly built. This may be partly true, but the explanation becomes less satisfying when the achievements themselves feel unusually abrupt, when the mathematics seem strangely optimized, when the astronomy proves correct, and when the culture keeps insisting, across genres and centuries, not that the gods inspired them vaguely, but that knowledge was handed over in structured form. The me again. Kingship again. The temple archives again. The continuity of Eridu again. The descent of order from heaven again. A pattern repeated too often to be merely decorative. The story becomes even stranger when we leave the marshes and temple courts for the dry, stubborn problem of language. Because one of the easiest ways to dismiss ancient claims is to pretend they are too obscure to evaluate. That excuse does not hold here. The wedges can be read. The signs can be sounded out. The grammar has been worked through by generations of scholars patient enough to spend their lives with broken clay. If the old texts are unsettling, it is not because they are mute. It is because they speak plainly often enough to leave us with an interpretive discomfort we would rather not carry. The road to hearing them again did not begin in Sumer at all. It began on a cliff in Persia, where the Behistun inscription was cut high above a desert road. I have always loved the sheer stubbornness of that image. A royal inscription perched so high that it became, centuries later, a ladder into lost languages. Wind against stone. Heat rising from the ground below. A man hanging by ropes, copying signs from a surface that was never meant for easy reading. There is something almost devotional in that effort, though of a different sort than the priests of Ur would have recognized. Henry Rawlinson and the other scholars who followed him were not decoding poetry alone. They were prying open an archive of human memory that had been closed for 2,000 years. Old Persian yielded first, then Akkadian, then the deeper challenge of Sumerian. And Sumerian was no kindly language to rediscover. It was an isolate, strange in grammar, strange in structure, preserved only through echoes, bilingual texts, lexical lists, school tablets. The patient habits of later scribes who had copied and translated older materials because they themselves were already trying not to lose what came before them. That detail matters. Even in antiquity, the Mesopotamians were preserving an old inheritance. The chain of recovery is layered. Modern scholars recovered Akkadian partly because ancient Akkadian scholars had already preserved Sumerian. The dead were helping the living hear the older dead. There is a quiet beauty in that, and a quiet sadness, too. Civilizations become their own translators once enough centuries pass. By the middle of the modern scholarly effort, tens of thousands of tablets had become readable. Contracts, receipts, royal boasts, omens, hymns, school exercises, mathematical lists, eclipse observations, letters so ordinary they feel like they were written yesterday by a tired official who wanted someone, somewhere, to behave sensibly for once. That is another reason the old world becomes hard to dismiss. Mythological texts do not stand alone in some dreamy separate pile. They sit beside account books and barley tallies. The same hands that recorded temple offerings and tax obligations also copied flood stories, king lists, hymns, and astronomical tables. The culture is one fabric. Pull one thread and the others move. This is where the real difficulty begins. Reading is not the same as understanding. You can translate every sign on a clay tablet correctly and still remain uncertain about what kind of truth the tablet thinks it is telling. That uncertainty is not a flaw in the scholarship. It is the condition of reading any dead civilization honestly. The words survive. Their internal world does not survive quite so neatly. Take a flood text. For example, Enki warns a pious man that a flood is coming. Build, seal, preserve, survive. The grammar is plain enough. But what are we reading? A memory of an actual catastrophic flood folded into theological form. A symbolic narrative about judgment and continuity. A ritual story meant to explain why certain cities claim ancient precedents. Or perhaps all of those at once. The text does not arrive with a modern editor whispering the proper category into your ear. It only says what it says. The same tension appears in astronomical material, and there it becomes much harder to soothe away. A list of star risings is not mere metaphor. A lunar period is not symbolic in the lazy way modern readers often mean when they want ancient material to behave itself. Numbers either match the sky or they do not. The Mesopotamian numbers match with unnerving frequency. So now the modern reader faces a choice that is less comfortable than it first appears. Accept the precision, but dismiss the attribution. Keep the calculations. Throw away the teachers. Keep the astronomy. Discard the gods. That is the standard compromise. And I understand why it exists. It lets the modern mind remain generous without becoming vulnerable. Ancient people were observant. Yes. Brilliant even. But when they say the knowledge came from the Anunnaki, that must be theology, cultural packaging, poetic framing. The words are readable, but not that readable. The attribution is the part we are allowed to smile at. Honestly, I have always found that selective seriousness a little suspicious. It has the flavor of someone who opens an old locked chest, finds accurate maps, careful instruments, and a note saying where they came from, then folds the note and pretends it was probably decorative. The Omen series makes this tension especially vivid. In texts like Enuma, Anu, and Lil, lunar alos, eclipses, planetary appearances, stellar placements, and weather phenomena are recorded with impressive care. Then they are connected to predicted terrestrial outcomes. Modern scholars separate the observational data from the omen logic. The first is astronomy. The second is divination. The first is valuable. The second is cultural noise. That separation may be useful, but I am not sure it is innocent. Because the Mesopotamians did not think they were doing two entirely different things. They believed the heavens formed a readable system in which order, sign, timing, and earthly consequence were linked. One can say they were wrong about causation, and often they were. Yet the deeper instinct behind their practice, that the sky carries structured information and that trained observers can read patterns from it, is not as foolish as modern arrogance likes to imply. We do similar things now with climate models, market indicators, satellite data, and statistical forecasts. We also live by signs read from systems larger than ourselves. We only flatter our signs with cleaner language. There is a moment, if you spend enough time with these tablets, when the old separation between sacred and technical begins to look like our problem rather than theirs. The Mesopotamian world did not insist on slicing reality into a scientific drawer and a religious drawer. The moon could be a body in the sky, a god, a timekeeper, and a station within cosmic order, all without contradiction. The contradiction appears only when modern readers demand that one layer cancel the others. You know that feeling when you enter an old room and realize it was arranged for a different way of thinking than your own. The proportions feel right, but the habits do not fit. Reading Mesopotamia is like that. You may understand every word and still be standing awkwardly in the doorway because the civilization itself refuses to share your categories. This becomes especially important when we return to the language of transmission. The old texts do not speak as though humans slowly deduced everything from scratch and then dressed their discoveries in divine robes for prestige. They speak as though knowledge was received, granted, shown, distributed, authorized. The choice of verbs matters. A culture can distinguish between inventing and receiving if it needs to. The Sumerian and Akkadian materials repeatedly lean toward receiving. The me are given. Kingship descends. Wisdom is shown. Paths are assigned. The world is organized. Humanity learns within an already structured order. That does not prove literal contact with sky beings. Of course, it proves something subtler and perhaps more powerful at first. It proves that the civilization itself wanted to be understood as instructed. And when that self-description is paired with mature mathematics, early precision, stable institutional preservation, and an astronomical tradition that keeps producing correct results, the claim becomes hard to ignore, even if one refuses its strongest reading. I think that is why the cuneiform record feels so alive. It is not merely a pile of old myths waiting for modern intelligence to rescue them from themselves. It is an archive arguing with us. It keeps saying, "No, you are reading us too safely. We meant the gods. We meant the teaching. We meant the order of the sky as something established, not discovered by accidental cleverness alone. We meant what we wrote, even if we wrote it in a conceptual world you no longer share." This is where the temptation of reduction becomes very strong. One can say the gods are personifications of natural principles. One can say the Anunnaki are symbolic expressions of institutional authority, or poetic masks for a deeper psychological truth, or the ancient habit of narrating social development as divine gift. All of those readings can illuminate something. None fully cancels the others. The most interesting possibility remains that the old texts are preserving memory in theological form, memory of real transmission from a source experienced as external, superior, and prior. That is a difficult sentence to leave alone by a fire at night. Real transmission, external source, superior and prior. It pushes the listener toward a ledge and then asks him not to rush, only to look down carefully. By now, the small museum fragment, with its star trajectories, has become part of a much larger room. We are no longer staring at one tablet and wondering how it could exist. We are standing inside a civilizational archive whose languages have been recovered with rigor, whose technical competence can be verified, and whose interpretive claims remain disturbingly open. The wedges have been read. The grammar has been argued through. The numbers can be checked. Yet the old question remains intact. What were they trying to tell us when they said the heavens were organized? That knowledge was given, that the moon held the first station, that the Anunnaki taught. That is the point at which the story must finally turn and face those teachers directly. Because once the languages are heard again, the next step cannot be avoided. We have to ask who the Anunnaki were in the imagination of Mesopotamia, and what sort of beings the texts believed had arranged the sky, distributed civilization, and placed the moon where human attention would find it first. There is no safe distance left now. The archive has spoken enough to make silence impossible, and the oldest names are beginning to step forward out of the clay. There is a softness to the clay and a hardness to the implication. We can forgive metaphor. We can forgive broken chronology. What is harder to forgive, if one wants the past to remain simple, is consistency. The same archive that preserves mundane administration preserves the repeated claim that ordered knowledge came from beyond ordinary human beginnings. That claim survives translation. It survives grammar. It survives our discomfort. The Anunnaki enter the story with the calm authority of names that expected to be understood. That is one of the most striking things about them. The old texts do not introduce them with nervous apology or dreamy vagueness. they appear as known powers, a collective with rank, jurisdiction, and consequence. Their exact profile shifts across centuries, as all large traditions do. In one period, they are the great gods of the upper order. In another, they become more tightly connected with judgment, the underworld, or the divine assembly. Yet beneath the variations, one structure remains. These are not random spirits. They are an organized body of superhuman authorities associated with the heavens, with order, and with the distribution of roles in both cosmos and civilization. That administrative quality matters. The Anunnaki are rarely described as chaotic bursts of sacred energy. They deliberate. They assign. They judge. They convene. They authorize. In stories like Atrahasis and in the grand cosmic ordering of later texts, they behave less like untamed mythic monsters and more like a governing council whose members hold specialized domains. The feeling is almost bureaucratic, though on a scale large enough to make the word sound absurd and then correct a moment later. In Atrahasis, before humanity exists, the gods themselves labor. Canals must be dug, water systems maintained. The lesser divine beings, the Igigi in some versions, tire of the burden and revolt. Then the higher council gathers. Anu is present. Enlil is present. Enki is present. A solution is debated. Humanity is created to bear the work. The whole narrative is surprisingly practical. It is not a mystical hymn to spontaneous creation. It is a labor problem solved by administrative means. That alone tells you what kind of universe Mesopotamia imagined. Ordered, stratified, managed. I have always found that both funny and chilling. Not funny in a mocking way, more in the way one sometimes laughs softly when an ancient text turns out to be far more worldly than expected. The great cosmic mystery opens, and instead of pure transcendence, one finds committees, assignments, infrastructure, complaints from overworked subordinates, and the invention of humanity as a labor solution. It is hard not to admire the bluntness. And yet the same Anunnaki who appear in that almost material way are also the source of knowledge beyond ordinary human reach. This is the key tension that modern readers often flatten too quickly. The beings in these texts are not fragile abstractions representing only reign or kingship or fertility in some neat symbolic sense. They are treated as real presences with physical habits, templas, requirements, meals, rivalries, and locations. At the same time, they know more than humans. Far more. They organize the heavens. They distribute the me. They grant kingship. They assign paths to celestial bodies. They establish the framework within which human society can function at all. The modern impulse is to call that inconsistency. The old Mesopotamian impulse was simply to call it reality. If you were standing in a temple court at Ur under a bright moon, the experience would probably make the point more gently than any argument can. The ziggurat rising in steps. The night air dry above, cooler near the brick. Priests moving with rehearsed certainty through duties tied to lunar phases. Offerings set out not for a metaphor, but for a presence. The moon overhead not merely admired, but measured. The body in the sky and the god attached to it not separated into opposing camps. The whole scene unified by the assumption that cosmic order is personal, technical, and sacred all at once. This is why the moon god matters so much in the Anunnaki framework. Nanna in Sumerian, Sin in Akkadian, he is not simply another shining face among many. He is firstborn of Enlil in some traditions. He governs the night. He regulates the month. He holds authority over timing, recurrence, and the visible movement that every careful observer can follow without fail. In a cosmos organized by higher powers, the moon becomes the first stable lesson available to human eyes. You could almost call it the beginner text of the sky. First station. Again, we return to that phrase, because the Anunnaki context sharpens it. A station is not just a place. It is a post within an ordered system, a place where one presence remains, or through which movement is coordinated. If the heavens are being organized, then the moon is not merely set in motion. It is assigned significance. It is made into the nearest visible anchor of the celestial order. The Babylonian and later Mesopotamian materials preserve that pattern beautifully, and a little eerily. In Enuma Elish, after Marduk defeats Tiamat and reorders the cosmos, the stars are arranged, the year is divided, stations are assigned, and the moon receives explicit regulation. Its path is established. Its phases are appointed. The visible order of the sky is not discovered. It is instituted. That difference in language is one of the softest and strongest pieces of evidence in the whole tradition. The heavens are spoken of as a planned structure. What kind of beings plan a cosmos? The Mesopotamian answer is not one lonely, all-powerful creator speaking into a void. It is a council, a hierarchy, a distributed order of powerful intelligences whose domains intersect and whose decisions shape both heaven and earth. That distributed model, frankly, feels closer to how complex systems often work than many simpler religious schemes do, which may be one reason it survives so vividly in the imagination. There is also the matter of celestial assignment. Major visible planets are associated with great divine figures. The moon with Sin, the sun with Shamash, Venus with Ishtar, other celestial zones linked with other gods. Modern readers often say this is merely ancient personification. Perhaps in part, yet the old texts go further than decorative naming. They speak as though divine responsibility and celestial location correspond. The sky is not only symbolized by the gods, it is administered through them. You know that feeling when a map stops looking decorative and starts looking operational. That is what happens here. Once celestial objects are assigned, paths specified, months divided, stations established, and the same culture then produces accurate astronomical tracking of those objects. The theological framework begins to look like an explanatory shell around a highly structured observational system. Or, if one is willing to take the more daring step, around memory of actual instruction from beings experienced as the governors of that system. This is where the Anunnaki become difficult to reduce. One can say they are gods and leave it at that. One can say they are poetic embodiments of cosmic principles. One can say they encode memory of teachers, predecessors, or some superior class of knowledge bearers. The reason the question remains alive is that the texts support more than one layer at once. The beings are mythic and practical, symbolic and personal, cosmic and administrative. Those combinations are not signs of confusion. They are signs of a worldview in which categories had not yet been politely severed from one another. Enki is perhaps the clearest example of this. He dwells in the Apsu, the subterranean sweet waters beneath the earth. He holds wisdom, craft, calculation, hidden counsel, the me themselves. He advises, circumvents, teaches, preserves. In flood stories, he acts as humanity's advocate, ensuring continuity of both life and knowledge. He knows before humans know. He gives procedures, not just comfort, boat dimensions, preservation strategies, technical means of survival. That is a teacher's role in the most concrete sense. Enlil, by contrast, holds authority over earth, kingship, decree, storm, command. He rules the exposed world. He is nearer to political order and judgment. Anu remains the high celestial sovereign. The pattern again is unmistakable. This is a structured ruling body with differentiated competences. Once you understand that, the claim that the Anunnaki taught humanity no longer sounds like one vague statement about divine inspiration. It sounds like multiple channels of instruction within a hierarchy of specialized knowledge, and the moon fits into that hierarchy in the most visible way possible. It is the nearest clock, the nearest sign, the nearest moving body whose phases ordinary people can track and whose deeper motions trained priests can calculate. If you wanted to educate a young civilization in celestial order, where would you begin? Not with a faint, distant star lost in seasonal haze. Not with a planet whose behavior requires too much interpretive maturity too early. You would begin with the moon. I have always found that logic almost tender, in a severe sort of way. The first lesson would have to be something visible enough for everyone, yet structured enough to lead into mathematics. The moon is exactly that. It is beautiful enough to hold devotion, regular enough to train counting, complex enough to reward precision, and important enough to anchor calendar, ritual, and state time. It is the perfect first station. The source transcript keeps leaning on that point for good reason. Why did the Mesopotamians care so much about the moon? Why measure it with such intensity? Why place it so centrally in theology, kingship, festivals, and calculation? The answer it offers is simple and unsettling. Because the moon was not just another object. It was the first assigned marker in an ordered heaven, and its movements preserved something that those who knew how to read it were meant to remember. That does not have to mean a machine hidden in lunar dust. In fact, the older and more interesting idea is subtler than that. What the Anunnaki may have left on the moon, in the language of the texts, is not hardware but significance. A coded role, a stable position in a transmitted system of knowledge. The moon becomes a visible repository of order, a recurring proof that the sky follows a signed law, Stand long enough beneath such a moon, and the thought becomes almost hypnotic. The same pale disk over the marshes of Sumer, over the stepped terraces of Ur, over scribal courts where young apprentices copied old signs, over kings who believed their authority descended from a source older than ambition, over priests who knew that the month began not when they wished it, but when the sky allowed. The Anunnaki do not need to land in a dramatic shower of fire for their presence to saturate such a world. They need only to be believed as the original arrangers of the order everyone depends upon. And that is why the next movement of the story belongs to astronomy itself. Because once the Anunnaki are understood as organized teachers and assigners of celestial stations, the question sharpens. Did the actual astronomical record of Mesopotamia behave as if it were built from long gradual guesswork? Or did it behave as if the foundational framework had arrived already prepared? The moon, the first station, will have to answer that for us as best it can, through eclipse cycles, calendars, and numbers pressed into clay by patient hands who believed they were preserving lessons older than history. By the time we reach the astronomical tablets themselves, the room grows quieter in a different way. The theological language does not disappear, but the numbers begin to sit on the table like little stones, cool, exact, difficult to charm away. This is where many modern readers become slightly uneasy, because poetry can be admired from a safe distance, while calculation has a habit of asking for a decision. Either the ancient record is wrong, or it is not. Either the lunar periods, eclipse intervals, and positional schemes are close to reality, or they are not. And once we discover that they are often very close indeed, the next question arrives without mercy. How did this precision become possible so early? The moon is the best place to feel that pressure. It was not just one celestial body among many in Mesopotamian thought. It dominated time. It governed months, festival cycle, ritual observance, agricultural timing, and much of the visible rhythm by which temple and city alike organized life. Yet practical importance alone does not explain the intensity of the attention given to it. The Old Omen series, Enuma, Anu, and Lil, devotes an astonishing portion of its bulk to lunar matters. Halos around the moon, eclipses, irregular appearances, interactions with stars and planets. The wording may frame these observations as signs, but the observations themselves are specific and careful. The sky is being watched with a devotion so disciplined that it starts to look almost like an engineering habit. Imagine a rooftop at Ur during a warm night in the deep past. The brick still gives off the last of the heat it drank all day. A breeze moves in from the river, carrying dampness, reed, scent, perhaps a trace of fish or mud from the lower places beyond the city. Oil lamps burn low behind a parapet, their light carefully controlled so the eyes of the observers are not spoiled. The priest astronomers stand or sit with tablets near them, their bodies quiet, their attention pointed upward. Nothing dramatic is happening. No gods are descending in flaming chariots. Nothing that would satisfy a careless appetite for spectacle. There is only the moon, and the people who know that the moon is never only the moon. You know that feeling when someone important enters a room so softly that only the few attentive people notice first. That is how the moon behaves in Mesopotamian culture. It rises and the whole system of time adjusts around it. The astronomical texts show that this adjustment was not vague. It was numerical. The Mesopotamians tracked the length of the synodic month, the interval from new moon to new moon, with remarkable care. The value later preserved in Babylonian calculations comes astonishingly close to the modern figure. That claim is not romantic guesswork. It is one of those dry facts that scholars check with no need for incense or dramatic music. And still, it remains unsettling. A civilization without telescopes, without polished observatory lenses, without modern clocks, preserves a lunar month value so accurate that the error is tiny. How does that happen? The mainstream explanation is patient and respectable. Long observation across centuries. Many recorded cycles. Averaging. Institutional continuity. Mathematical refinement. There is truth in that. A temple tradition can indeed watch the sky longer than one life, longer than one dynasty, longer than one language in some cases. If enough observers inherit the same task, small inaccuracies can be reduced, and stable cycles can emerge from the noise. I would not dismiss that, but I would say, very softly, that it does not erase the strangeness. It only moves the strangeness to another place. Because the same explanation requires a civilization to establish, very early, a stable and disciplined observational culture, a mathematical notation powerful enough to manage the results, and a reason to care at a level far beyond practical minimum. Rough timekeeping does not demand the kind of precision the tablets preserve. A farmer does not need subtle lunar theory to know when to plant by the season. A festival calendar can survive with approximation. What the Mesopotamians pursued was much finer than approximation. They pursued something closer to fidelity. That word matters here. Fidelity. Not just curiosity. Not just utility. Fidelity to a pattern believed to matter in itself. The eclipse material sharpens this even more. Lunar eclipses are frightening if encountered without explanation, but they are also mathematically beautiful if watched long enough. The Mesopotamians did watch long enough. They observed, recorded, compared, preserved, and eventually recognized the recurrence pattern, later known as the Saros cycle. Roughly 18 years, 11 days, and several hours, after which eclipse conditions repeat in closely related form. To discover that through observation alone requires patience of a scale that almost feels monastic. To preserve it demands archives, trained readers, and institutions that do not shrug when a generation dies. To use it effectively demands confidence that the heavens are not random but law-governed. That last point is where the older theological frame returns with surprising force. The Mesopotamians believed exactly that. The heavens were ordered, not merely regular in a neutral, mechanical sense, but ordered by assignment, decree, and established paths. This belief may sound mythic, but it produces the right emotional environment for systematic astronomy. If the moon is the first station, if sin follows an appointed route, if celestial motions carry legible structure, then one does not observe casually. One observes as if reading a text placed there with intent. Honestly, that may be why the whole tradition lasted so long. Practical astronomy can flourish for a while. Sacred astronomy can survive empires. If you were looking over the shoulder of a late Babylonian calculator, the scene would be far more modest than the grandeur of the result suggests. A tablet, columns, numbers, no poetry on the face of it, no devotional sighs, just repeated values, intervals, adjustments, placement. Perhaps the scribe has a little grit on his wrist from the clay. Perhaps the room is warmer than he would like. Perhaps outside, ordinary life continues with its arguments, purchases, and annoyances. Inside, however, a different labor is unfolding. The moon is being rendered in numbers, not conquered, not demystified in the modern sense, but translated into repeatable prediction. This is the point where the old temple and the old observatory stop looking like separate things. In Mesopotamia, they were fused because the cosmos itself was treated as a sacred administrative field. The priest who serves the moon god and the observer who measures lunar motion are performing different sides of the same act. One side bows, the other counts. Both assume the path is meaningful. And the path was meaningful in more ways than one. The moon governed the months, yes, but also acted as the primary check on larger calendrical systems. The lunar year drifts against the solar year. Everyone using a lunar calendar discovers this eventually. Festivals slide. Seasons go out of tune. Agricultural timing becomes awkward. The Mesopotamians address this through intercalation, the insertion of extra months to keep the calendar aligned. This was not a trivial adjustment made by shrugging at the sky. It required close attention to stellar references, seasonal relationships, and repeated correction. The moon, in other words, was not only a sign to be admired, it was a standard to be maintained inside a larger harmonized order. The source transcript presses on another detail that deserves to remain in the firelight a little longer. The earliest surviving phases of the tradition already feel mature. The moon is not being observed by people taking their first awkward steps toward astronomy. It is being observed by people who already know what to look for. That is a subtle difference, but a profound one. First, observers gaze. Trained inheritors compare. The tablets feel like the work of inheritors. You can sense it in the confidence of the lists, in the way values are presented, in the manner observational material sits inside an already formed framework. Even if the framework was developed over time by human effort, it presents itself in the surviving record as something well underway from the moment the written archive becomes rich enough for us to see it clearly. Once again, Sumer and its descendants feel like a civilization opening the notebook at page 3 rather than page 1. There is a gently comic detail here that I cannot resist. Modern people often speak of ancient observers as if they were charmingly innocent, shuffling outside at night to point at pretty lights and invent imaginative names. Meanwhile, the ancient observers themselves are carefully logging eclipse intervals, phase behavior, calendrical drift, and recurring patterns, while many modern people cannot remember what phase the moon is in without glancing at a phone. The old world may have been less technologically loud, but in certain forms of attention, it was ferociously disciplined. That conversion is, perhaps, the most beautiful and disturbing feature of Mesopotamian astronomy. The moon remains holy. The moon also becomes measurable. The two truths are never forced apart. Instead, they strengthen one another. Because the moon is sacred, it must be observed exactly. Because it is observed exactly, its sacred status feels confirmed. The cycle of reverence and precision closes like a ring. So what did the Anunnaki leave on the moon? If the texts are to be taken seriously in their own terms. At this stage in the story, the best answer is not machinery, not a hidden city, not any of the louder fantasies that modern hunger likes to project into old silence. What they left, if left is the right word, was assignment, significance, an appointed path, a visible body whose regularity could train human minds into relationship with an ordered cosmos. The moon becomes the first proof that the heavens are not chaos. A lesson written in repeated light. And lessons require students. That is why the tablets matter. They are not only records of what the moon did. They are records of people being taught how to read what the moon does. Whether the teachers were literal divine beings, remembered predecessors, or institutional ancestors transfigured by theology remains open. The student posture remains obvious. These observers inherit procedures. They inherit values. They inherit a conviction that the sky contains structured information. The moon is where that inheritance begins. The firelight grows quieter around this kind of thought. Nothing crashes. No revelation shouts. There is only the old silver body over the river world of Mesopotamia, and the humans below it learning to track its motions with a seriousness that now looks almost prophetic. They counted because they believed it mattered. They believed it mattered because they had been told the moon was first. The first station, the first marker, the first bright surface where an ordered heaven let itself be seen. And once a civilization takes that lesson to heart, the next thing it needs is a tool powerful enough to keep the lesson exact across centuries. That tool was not bronze, not glass, not a lens ground in secret. It was a number system. A strange, elegant number system so well suited to the sky that even now, every time we count time or measure a circle, we still move our minds along the grooves the Mesopotamians cut long ago. If the moon was the first lesson, then base 60 was the grammar that made the lesson durable. This is where the whole story turns from beautiful to almost suspiciously elegant. Because once you begin looking closely at Mesopotamian mathematics, you find a system so well suited to time, unglis, sigla, and repeated division that it feels less like a local quirk and more like a tool chosen for a task. Most people never pause to wonder why a circle has 360 degrees, or why an hour has 60 minutes, or why a minute has 60 seconds. These things arrive in childhood like furniture already sitting in the room. We inherit them, use them, complain when we are late, and almost never ask how such a peculiar arrangement became normal. The answer, as quietly as an old tablet in a drawer, leads back to Mesopotamia. The sexagesimal system, the base 60 system, is one of the oldest great mathematical inheritances still active in daily modern life. That alone should make it remarkable. But what makes it eerie within this story is not just its survival, it is its fitness. 60 divides beautifully. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30. Fractions become manageable. Cycles can be split and recombined with grace. For astronomy, for angular measurement, for timekeeping, it is wonderfully convenient. For ordinary counting by a casual agricultural people, it is far less obvious. That is the pressure point the source transcript keeps touching. Why this system? Why so early? Why so thoroughly? A person can, of course, explain its emergence through habit, trade, finger joint counting methods, administrative convention, or a mixture of local developments we no longer see clearly because the earliest phases are lost. I do not dismiss such explanations. History is full of paths that later seem inevitable and were, in truth, accidental. Yet base 60 still feels different. It feels prepared. Not impossible, just prepared. Like a key cut before the lock, it will spend centuries opening. If you were in a scribal school in ancient Mesopotamia, the soundscape would not be mystical. It would be repetitive. Students chanting tables, styluses tapping, a teacher correcting a line with weary exactness, clay surfaces drying a little too quickly if the day were hot, dust in the corners, perhaps someone suppressing a yawn while copying numerical sequences again and again. There is something deeply human in that scene, almost comically familiar. And yet out of that repetition comes a numerical culture so refined that later astronomy can move inside it like water in a carved channel. The school tablets themselves are among the most persuasive witnesses. Multiplication table, reciprocal lists, area calculations, volume problems, practical exercises that feel so ordinary you might overlook their significance. But ordinariness is exactly what makes them important. Base 60 was not a rare priestly trick reserved for one hidden chamber. It was embedded in training. It became the way literate technical culture thought. That kind of embedding suggests not an odd experiment, but foundational choice. You know that feeling when a tool fits the hand so well that you stop noticing it and begin noticing only what it lets you do. That is how base 60 behaves in the Mesopotamian record. By the time the astronomical material becomes dense, the number system is already there, doing its work almost invisibly. It divides the circle. It structures time. It supports computational procedures. It allows fractions to settle more cleanly than they would in base 10. The sky becomes easier to calculate because the mathematics has already been tailored to cyclic behavior. This is where the moon story and the mathematical story lock together so neatly that a cautious listener may start to feel the hairs lift slightly on the back of the neck. If a civilization believed the heavens were ordered and that the moon was the first visible station in that order, what kind of mathematical system would best preserve the ability to read that station? Not a clumsy one, not a temporary one optimized for cycles. And that is exactly what appears. The intercalation rules in the old astronomical compendia deepen the sense of design. A lunar year does not align perfectly with the solar year. Anyone depending on moon months for ritual and agriculture will eventually face drift. The months will walk out of step with the seasons unless corrected. The Mesopotamians did correct it. Not loosely, not with a shrug, but through structured insertion of extra months guided by astronomical observation. This is the work of people who are not merely noticing the sky. They are maintaining a system in relation to the sky. I have always found maintenance more interesting than discovery in ancient stories. Discovery is dramatic and flattering. Maintenance is ardor. It requires memory, continuity, institutional, and a willingness to care about accuracy long after the original excitement is gone. The Mesopotamians cared in exactly that way. The moon was watched. The year was adjusted. The stars were used as checks. Shadow lengths were noted. The heavens became a reference framework against which earthly time could be repaired when it drifted. The shadow tables in texts like Mol Apin intensify the impression. Here we are in a world before telescopes, before precision metal instruments in the later scientific sense, and yet there is careful attention to how a vertical object casts a shadow at different times, how light and angle can be used to track order. Again, one may say this arose from patient observation, and one would not be wrong. But the broader question lingers. Why does the whole framework feel mature so early? Why do the surviving records keep sounding like people refining inherited competence rather than struggling toward first competence? The late Babylonian mathematical astronomy makes that question almost painful. Step functions, arithmetical schemes, velocity models, predictive tables. When modern historians of science explain these methods, the language becomes unexpectedly modern. Algorithms, computational procedures, parametric values, predictive sequences. The clay may be ancient, but the intellectual mood can feel startlingly fresh. One is looking not at dreamy omens, but at a civilization conducting numerical negotiations with celestial motion. And yet the tradition itself keeps refusing to take credit in the way a modern scientific civilization would. It does not say, "We discovered these methods through heroic independence and relentless curiosity." It says, "The heavens were organized, the stations assigned, the knowledge taught." That repeated refusal of self-authorship may be the strangest thing of all. Great cultures usually decorate themselves with claims of invention. Mesopotamia so often decorates itself with claims of transmission. If you were standing beside a later Babylonian astronomer as he filled a tablet with columns of values, you might not notice anything supernatural at all. Just concentration. A lamp guttering softly, the stylus making quick, controlled impressions. Perhaps a clerk nearby with another tablet for comparison. Outside, a braise. Yet in that unremarkable room, celestial mechanics is being modeled with nothing more glamorous than clay, number, and inherited method. The plainness of the scene makes the achievement even more unnerving. Extraordinary results emerging from ordinary gestures, because the intellectual framework underneath has been made stable enough to outlive wonder. This stability is where the transmission model becomes emotionally persuasive, even for those who resist its strongest form. A human community can invent astonishing things. Yes, but a human community Preserving an inherited structure often behaves differently from one inventing from scratch. It teaches differently. It reveres differently. It copies with a different seriousness. The Mesopotamian archive has that copied seriousness in abundance. There is also the question of optimization. Base 60 is not merely good enough for astronomy. It is beautiful for astronomy. That does not prove that sky teachers literally descended and explained division to the first scribes. I know. But it does create the sensation of fittingness that haunts the entire story. The mathematics fits the cosmos being described. The moon fits the role of first station. The institutions fit the demands of preservation. The texts fit the posture of a student civilization. Too many things fit. Perhaps that is why the old idea of the me returns here with renewed force. If the me are best understood not as vague magical properties, but as transferable packages of ordered capability, then mathematics belongs among them very naturally. A base system, a method of division, a way of aligning year and month, a rule for predicting return. These are exactly the sorts of foundational capacities a civilization would experience as given if it received them before it understood how deeply they shaped everything else. The fire has a way of making such thoughts feel older than they are. You can almost imagine the first moment some young scribe realizes that the tables he has memorized are not merely school burdens, but tools for reading the path of the moon with uncanny exactness. He might not feel proud in a modern sense. He might feel admitted, initiated into a structure that was waiting for him before his birth. That, to me, is very close to the emotional core of transmitted knowledge. Not invention, but entry. And so the moon and the number system begin to mirror one another. The moon is cyclical, visible, serene, relentless. Base 60 is divisible, elegant, stable, relentless in its own way. One is the sign in the sky. The other is the instrument in the hand. Put them together, and a civilization can build a durable relationship with celestial order. That relationship becomes calendar, ritual, astronomy, kingship timing, omen interpretation, and the broader feeling that the world is not loose but arranged. That arrangement is what the Anunnaki are said to have established. Again and again, the texts return to decree, assignment, and transmission. The celestial bodies are organized. The year is divided. The moon follows its set path. Humanity is taught to read what has been set in place. If that language encodes memory rather than mere poetic habit, then what the Anunnaki left on the moon may be understood as the first accessible portion of a larger mathematical cosmos. A visible lesson suspended above the earth so reliably that no generation could miss it entirely. There is something both gentle and severe in that thought. Gentle, because the moon is soft light, repetition, return. Severe, because behind that soft light stands a discipline of measurement that does not tolerate casualness for long. The Mesopotamians loved the moon enough to count it. Perhaps that is the best way to say it. They loved it, feared it, timed themselves by it, and kept cutting numbers into clay until its path became one of the oldest, stable conversations between the sky and the human mind. Once that conversation exists, The next question presses closer. If the mathematics was inherited, and the moon was the first station, then what kind of preserving intelligence stood behind both? That is why the story must now turn toward Enki, the old keeper of wisdom and rescue, the one figure in Mesopotamian tradition who most clearly embodies the preservation of knowledge through danger, loss, and catastrophe. The figure of Enki enters this story like cool water under a hot floor. By the time the flood traditions appear, by the time the moon has already become the first station, and base 60 has already become the grammar of celestial reading. Mesopotamian culture has one god whose role feels almost painfully specific. He is the keeper of hidden wisdom. He is the lord of the Absu, the fresh water deep beneath the earth. He is the one who knows before others know, who preserves before others think to preserve, who bends rules not to end order, but to keep order from becoming sterile enough to kill the thing it governs. I have always thought that if one wanted to understand how the Mesopotamians imagined transmitted knowledge surviving across impossible spans of time, one would eventually have to sit quietly with Enki. Not because he is the loudest god. He is not. Not because he is the most politically dominant. Often, he is not that either. But because he holds the exact emotional position this story has been circling from the beginning. He is the preserver of dangerous intelligence. He is the one who keeps civilization from starting over in ignorance every time catastrophe arrives. In the Eridu Genesis, in Atrahasis, in the flood account embedded later in Gilgamesh, the pattern repeats with a steadiness that feels more deliberate each time you encounter it. Humanity multiplies. Trouble rise. The assembly moves toward destruction. Enki intervenus. He does not merely save bodies. He saves continuity. That distinction is the heart of the matter. If all he wanted was biological survival, then any handful of breathing humans would suffice. But the texts insist on something more careful. Seed is preserved. Craft is preserved. Procedure is preserved. The possibility of rebuilding civilization without falling back to pure helplessness is preserved. That is not sentimental rescue. That is information rescue. Picture the scene in the most human way possible. Reed walls, dry enough to whisper when wind passes over them. A house in uneasy stillness. A man not yet knowing that history is about to divide itself into before and after. Somewhere beyond him, the decisions of greater powers have already hardened. The flood will come. The order above has turned against the noise below. And then Enki, unable to openly violate the decree, speaks to the reed wall, to the house, to the listening man behind the wall. Build, measure, seal, preserve life. Use these materials. Follow these dimensions. It is a warning, yes, but more than that, it is technical instruction delivered under pressure. This is one of the reasons I cannot dismiss the old stories as mere moral theater. The details are too practical. The god does not send vague comfort. He sends method. There is something almost dryly amusing in that. The ancient crisis arrives. The gods argue. The waters gather. And the wisest divine figure responds not with a poem, but with engineering. You know that feeling when someone truly knowledgeable begins helping in a crisis. The room changes. panic loses a little ground. Because the knowledge is not decorative. It does things. Enki carries exactly that atmosphere in these narratives. He is wisdom in the form of usable procedure. The same structure appears outside the flood stories as well. The me are kept with him, or associated with his sanctuary, or distributed under his care. Inanna may carry them away in one mythic episode, but the point remains. Foundational capacities of civilization begin with his custody. Kingship, writing, craft, organization, authority, artistry, judgment. Not airy blessings, but functions. Civilizational functions. Enki is less the god of vague intelligence than the god of structured capability. That is why Eridu matters so much, and why the source transcript kept returning to it. Eridu was not simply old. It was remembered as first. The first city? The place where kingship first descended from heaven. The place where Enki established his shrine in the Abzu. Archaeologically, the site shows temple after temple, raised on the same sacred point over deep time. Liturgically, it is saturated with primacy. Emotionally, it feels like a memory anchor. A civilization came back to the same place again and again because it believed that knowledge had entered the human world there in a concentrated way. If you were standing in ancient Eridu at dawn, the place would not look like a cosmic laboratory in any theatrical sense. Mud brick, rei, water channels, the smell of wet earth, birds over the margins, priests moving in routines older than their grandfathers. But that is exactly the right setting for transmitted knowledge in the Mesopotamian imagination. It arrives not in a futuristic chamber, but in a sacred administrative center, a place where worship, storage, training, counting, copying, and instruction are fused so tightly that the difference between temple and archive begins to blur. The Abzu itself is one of the most haunting symbols in all of this. Beneath the earth, beneath the visible city, beneath the noise and heat and politics of the surface, there is a hidden freshwater deep, a source, un réservoir. In mythic language, it is Enki domain. In emotional language, it is the perfect image for preserved knowledge. Cool, hidden, life-giving, not obvious to the careless eye, yet feeding everything above. A hidden source below. A visible order above. Human civilization in the middle, surviving by what it receives from both. That structure is so elegant that one begins to see why Enki becomes the necessary teacher in a story about the moon and transmitted astronomy. The moon may be the first station in the sky, but someone has to instruct humanity in how to read that station. Someone has to preserve the methods through floods, dynastic collapse, linguistic change, and the laziness that always threatens any tradition requiring exactness. Enki is the one figure repeatedly shown doing precisely that work. He keeps the line from snapping. In Adrahasis, when the gods decide humanity has become too numerous and too loud, plague comes, drought comes, famine comes, and still Enki finds ways to preserve the line. Even when the flood becomes unavoidable, he does not surrender to oblivion. He transmits. The texts describe a divine assembly capable of destruction. but they also describe one member of that assembly who refuses to let accumulated knowledge drown with the cities. That is a very unusual theological choice. It reveals a civilization that cared intensely about continuity. And continuity is really what the whole moon mystery comes down to. Not whether an ancient person could look up and admire silver light. Of course they could. Not whether they could count months. Of course they could. The deeper question is how such long continuity of high precision was maintained. How did the lunar record remain good enough, generation after generation, to produce figures and cycles modern astronomy still finds impressively accurate? One answer is institutional discipline alone. Another answer, the one the Mesopotamians themselves favored, is that such discipline was guided by a preserving intelligence that kept the methods intact. The more one watches Enki in the texts, the more that second answer stops sounding childish and starts sounding culturally coherent. This is the God who protects protocols. The God who keeps the fundamental packages of order available to humanity. The God who whispers through walls rather than letting the archive burn. The God who understands that once knowledge is lost deeply enough, rebuilding becomes slower, harsher, and far more fragile. I have always found one detail especially moving. In the later flood account, Utnapishtim does not survive alone with a vague promise and a pretty rainbow. He survives with the means to continue living in a structured world. That is a completely different kind of rescue. It suggests that the preservation of organized knowledge mattered as much as the preservation of flesh. When a culture tells the story that way 3 times over, more than 1,000 years, it is teaching us how it thought civilization actually endured. Through instruction, through copying, through hidden protectors, through someone deciding that knowledge must pass intact through disaster. This also helps explain why the me are never treated casually. They can be moved, yes, even stolen in myth, but never shrugged off. They are loaded, carried, retained, and fought over because they are the components of ordered life. The very idea that writing, authority, music, judgment, accounting, metalwork, and political power can exist as discrete, transferable things is astonishingly close to thinking of civilization as modular knowledge. Not spontaneous habit, but packages. That way of imagining knowledge makes the transmission model feel almost native to the culture. The Anunnaki do not merely inspire, they distribute. And so we come very close to the answer without yet speaking it fully. What if the moon was tracked so obsessively not only because it governed time, but because it sat at the front edge of a preserved system Enki and the others had handed down? The first station, the first visible lesson, the first place in the sky where trained minds could verify that ordered knowledge really corresponded to reality. If the moon behaved as taught, then the broader cosmology held. If the calculations worked, then the tradition still carried truth. In that sense, the moon was not only a celestial body, it was a continuing test of the inherited archive. There is something very beautiful about that. A little severe, perhaps, but beautiful. The sky itself becomes a tablet no flood can fully erase. Clay can break. Libraries can burn. Dynasties can die, and languages can shift. Yet, The moon keeps moving. The station remains. The student can look up again and begin relearning if the methods survive somewhere below. In an archive, in a temple, in a teacher, in a god of wisdom whispering through the reed wall of history itself. That is why Enki belongs here so centrally. Without him, the story of transmitted astronomy becomes harder, colder, and less plausible emotionally. With him, continuity acquires a face. Not the face of a conqueror or judge, but of a keeper. Someone who knows where the packages are stored. Someone who knows what to save first. Someone who would understand, perhaps better than any other figure in the Mesopotamian world, that if humanity were ever to forget how to read the moon, it would forget more than a calendar. It would forget the first station of the old order itself. And that leaves only one final step for us. We must return to the moon, to the museum fragment, to the old claim that what the Anunnaki left there was not an artifact in the simple modern sense, but a readable station within an organized heaven. The story has gathered everything it needs now. The cities, the me, the flood, the hidden keeper of wisdom, the mathematical grammar, the long continuity of exact watching. All of it now has to lean into the final question, the one shining over the whole investigation from the first minute. What, exactly, did they believe was preserved on the moon, and what remains of that belief for us tonight? By now, the moon has changed shape many times above us, at least in the imagination. It began as a museum question, a little clay fragment in London, and a handful of precise marks that should have been easier to explain than they are. Then it became a station. The first station, the nearest marker in an organized heaven. Then it became a lesson, a visible body whose reliable path trained scribes, priests, and mathematicians into a relationship with order. Then it became a test, the place where inherited knowledge could be checked against reality night after night, century after century. And now, at the end, it becomes something quieter and more difficult to dismiss. A repository, not of metal ruins or hidden domes in the modern feverish sense, but of preserved pattern. I think that is the final adjustment the story asks us to make. The title question sounds dramatic, perhaps deliberately so. What did the Anunnaki leave on the moon? It tempts the mind toward objects, debris, structures, traces that could be pointed to and photographed. But the Mesopotamian texts are not really pointing in that direction. They are pointing towards something older and more subtle, the thing left on the moon. If we listen carefully to the world of the tablets, is significance fixed inside celestial order? A path, a timing structure, a visible proof that the heavens were arranged and could be read. That may sound less exciting at first, but honestly, I think it is far more haunting. Anyone can invent a fantasy about a lost machine in lunar dust. It takes a colder imagination to suggest that the moon itself was used as a stable instructional device. The first bright page in a cosmic manual entrusted to a young civilization. If you were a teacher in the deepest old sense, and you wished to begin the education of humanity in celestial order, what would you choose? Not a hidden thing, not a secret requiring advanced equipment. You would choose the most obvious thing that still contains depth. something every child could see and every priest could study. Something simple enough to begin with and rich enough never to be exhausted. The moon is exactly that. It is the perfect first lesson. The source transcript was careful about one point that deserves to stay with us to the end. The ancient texts do not claim that the moon is important merely because people are sentimental about it. They claim it was assigned, governed, set on its path, given first importance among the celestial stations. And then they show, through centuries of practice, that Mesopotamian observers treated that claim with mathematical seriousness. They tracked the moon with extraordinary care. The two are not enemies there. They are partners. That partnership may be the oldest surviving clue of all. We keep trying to decide whether the tablets are myth or science, poetry or data, symbol or observation. The Mesopotamian archive keeps refusing the split. The moon is a god and an object, a ruler and a cycle, a sacred sign and a calculable path, a first station in divine order and a repeating observational problem solved by numerical care. The very refusal to choose may be what gives the record its power. Reality itself was not divided so politely in their eyes. So what did the Anunnaki leave? They left a framework in which the moon mattered enough to hold civilization together across time. They left a path worth measuring. They left the idea that celestial order was not accidental and that human beings could be taught to read it. They left mathematics suited to the work. They left institutions devoted to preserving the reading. They left stories explaining why the reading must not be lost, even through flood and dynastic ruin. They left, in short, a relationship between mind and sky stable enough to outlive the cities that first practiced it. There is something profoundly moving in that. The ziggurats are broken. The temple libraries are scattered across museum drawers. The languages had to be resurrected from cliffs, lexical lists, and damaged tablets. Yet the moon is still there, keeping the oldest appointment in the story. It rises on time. It changes by law. It invites counting. It permits prediction. It remains the first visible station whether anyone honors it as such or not. You know that feeling when something survives you so completely that your role shifts from owner to witness. That is what the moon does to every civilization. It outlasts each explanation. But Mesopotamia did something unusual with that pressure. It built an entire inheritance around the conviction that the moon was not merely outlasting them, it was teaching them, or carrying forward a teaching first given by others. Mainstream scholarship will remain cautious here, and on many points it is right to be cautious. There is no need to become childish, no need to shout. The astronomical precision is real. The cuneiform can be read. The theological framework is consistent. The transmission language is repeated. The sudden maturity of Sumer remains striking. The sexagesimal system remains oddly well designed for celestial work. All of that is enough to keep the deeper question open without forcing it into sensational certainty. I have always thought the most honest ending for a story like this is not a verdict, but a narrowing of the question. We do not have to decide tonight whether the Anunnaki were literal sky beings, remembered teachers from an older culture, symbolic masks for inherited wisdom, or some blend of those possibilities lost in deep time. What we can say is narrower and, in its way, stronger. The Mesopotamians believed they were taught. They named their teachers. They treated the moon as the first station in an ordered heaven. They tracked it with extraordinary care. The knowledge they preserved works. That final point keeps the story anchored. Works. The numbers work. The cycles work. The path works. This is not the soft realm of vague intuition. Something reliable was preserved. And when a civilization tells you that its reliable knowledge came from beyond itself, it may be wise not to smile too quickly. The little tablet in London now looks different from how it looked at the beginning. At first, it seemed like a curious artifact, perhaps impressive, perhaps slightly over-interpreted by modern mystery seekers. Now it feels like a surviving corner of a much larger archive. An archive built by people who understood themselves not as the first discoverers of heavenly truth, but as its careful copyists. Humanity at the beginning of recorded history, not inventing the sky, but taking dictation from it, or from those who claimed authority over it. If you were with me by the fire, I think this would be the moment when we both fell silent for a while and let the moon itself do the remaining work. There are stories that want to end with a dramatic reveal. This one is more ancient than that. It wants to end with recurrence, with the same object above us that stood above Eridu, Ur, Uruk, and Nippur. The same pale disk reflected in river water, caught on temple stairs, marked in waxy crescent, swallowed in eclipse shadow, restored again. The same first station continuing its path long after the scribes who counted it have turned to dust. Perhaps that is why the ancient mind placed so much weight there. The moon was not only visible, it was faithful. A civilization that felt itself taught by older powers would need some visible sign that the teaching still held. The moon provided that sign every month. Each successful prediction, each corrected calendar, each observed eclipse became another confirmation that the old order remained intact. The heavens had not forgotten the arrangement. And that may be the most intimate meaning of all. What the Anunnaki left on the moon was remembrance. Not memory in the sentimental human sense, but a preserved external memory, a repeating pattern that could teach again every generation. Even if libraries burned, even if flood waters rose, even if kingdoms fell, the lesson waited overhead. Look up. Count. Compare. Learn again. The first station has not moved from its appointed work. There is something gentle in ending there. We do not have to force the old texts into a shape neat enough for modern pride. We can let them remain what they are. Voices from the beginning of writing, telling us that civilization was instructed, that order was handed down, and that the moon was the nearest place where that order could be seen and measured. The fire is lower now in the imagination, and the room feels smaller in a pleasant way, as if the great spans of time have folded themselves into one circle of light. A museum drawer in London, a rooftop in Ur, a reed wall whispering before the flood, a scribe pressing numerical wedges into soft clay, a priest waiting for the first visible crescent, a modern listener glancing toward the window and then up into the dark. the same moon binding them, not by magic exactly, but by recurrence and the possibility that the oldest written minds on Earth were not foolish when they called it a station. So when the question returns one last time, what did the Anunnaki leave on the moon? The softest and strongest answer is this. They left a readable order. They left the first visible proof that heaven had structure. They left humanity a lesson in cycles, timing, measurement, and faithfulness. They left a celestial page bright enough to survive every collapsed city and every broken library. They left something that could not easily be destroyed because it was written not only on clay, but in the sky itself. And that is why the tablets still trouble us. Not because they ask us to believe too much, but because they ask whether we have been dismissing too much for too long. The moon goes on, keeping its ancient appointment. The wedges on the clay still say the knowledge was taught. The first station is still there. Quiet, silver, exact, and patient above the sleeping world. Outside the old cities, the rivers shifted their beds. Wind covered walls with dust. Names once spoken daily became specialist knowledge. Yet the moon remained available to anyone willing to give it time. That may be the final mercy in the whole story. The first lesson was never hidden completely. It could be forgotten, neglected, mistranslated, even mocked, but not erased. Each month it returned and offered itself again, not as proof enough to force belief, but as continuity enough to keep the question alive. And perhaps that is why the old archive endured so well beside it. Clay and moon share a peculiar patience. Clay remembers pressure. The moon remembers motion. Between them, the Mesopotamians placed one of the earliest durable conversations between human attention and cosmic order. We are still overhearing it now. So let the room fall quiet. Let the last of the fire settle into red. Let the museum drawer close softly in the mind. Let the temple stair cool beneath lunar light. Let the old calculations rest in their neat wedge rows. And let the first station continue its path above us, carrying forward the possibility that the beginning of civilization was not the beginning of knowledge, only the beginning of its written preservation. Good night.